in keeping with the theme of the historical moment, namely what the heck is going on. Our next guest is a professor of political science at Barnard College. Sheri E. Berman is an expert in the areas of European politics and political history, democracy and democratization, globalization, the history of the left, among other topics. She's been thinking and speaking about the significance of the Trump presidency, as so many of us have in the last few weeks, and she joins us now. Professor Berman, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
And I usually don't get quite that garbled in the introduction, but let's start with this. Your bio says you have studied the process of democratization a lot. At the risk of sounding flippant, how much investigation have you done into the topic of undemocratization or de-democratization?
Well, actually quite a lot, because although I have not previously thought as much about the United States, not thinking that our democracy was in any peril. Of course, it's quite common throughout history for democracies to kind of collapse back into dictatorships. In fact, sort of stable, consolidated liberal democracies are really, in most parts of the world, in Europe in particular, a product of the second half of the 20th century. So if you study political history, in fact, cycles of democracy and dictatorship are really what you're looking at. So that's a phenomenon that I'm quite familiar with, although again, I hadn't thought about it in the context of the United States quite so much until recently.
Yeah, it's an important point. I think a lot of us have been thinking about it, and there was actually a conscious movement, intellectual movement in the latter part of the 20th century to say, as Francis Fukuyama did, that perhaps we had reached the end of history and that we were now in a stable period of permanent liberal democracy. Do you think that's one of the reasons why people weren't expecting this? Because we had all, to one degree or another, whether we agreed with Fukuyama or not, had sort of imbibed this notion that the world we lived in was the world as it was going to be from now on?
Well, I think we definitely got used to a level of political stability in the West after the Second World War that the collapse of the Soviet Union actually only reinforced. But political instability is in fact the norm, a little bit less in the United States, but certainly in Europe, where ever since the French Revolution, as I said, there have been cycles of democracy and dictatorship, but our political memory is really quite short. And since 1945, Western Europe in particular has been democratic. And then again, the collapse of the Soviet Empire only, I think, led us to believe that the rest of the continent, as well as many other parts of the globe, would kind of slide naturally into that democratic camp. But if we had thought back on history and how long and how difficult it was for Europe to get to that, or Western Europe to get to the liberal democratic camp, we might have been a little bit less sanguine about, where history was headed. And again, in the United States, even if we think carefully about our own political history, up through the 1960s, we really only had a democracy for part of our citizens, not everyone who lived in the United States. And so while the United States has been politically stable, that has been built on a democracy that was not fully complete for all of our citizens until well into the 20th century.
Well, you raise a number of interesting points there, and again, we're talking with Professor Sheri Berman, but one of which is, and I just want to touch on this again before we leave it, but there are basically, as you well know, two different ways to look at history. One that I think became pretty popular after the Second World War in this country is a sort of evolutionary view that says that we are ceaselessly marching toward a better future, and things will continue to improve with every passing decade until we finally achieve a kind of stable utopia. And another that you keep referring to, which is the cyclical. Look, democracy and dictatorship come and go in a pattern, in a repetitive pattern, and we really shouldn't be surprised that this is happening. So I guess my final question on that topic is it fair to say we need to let go of the kind of utopian evolutionary view and just accept that we're basically, as individuals, always going to be, or as individuals within a historical cycle, going to be dealing with these types of shifts and be prepared to do our part within them?
Well, I would actually characterize my view as somewhere in between, which is clearly if we were to look back, for instance, to the period of the French Revolution, which is the event that most people see as kind of marking the dawn of the modern democratic age, there has been a huge amount of progress, not just politically. I mean, there's many, many more democracies today than there were in the 18th, 19th, or early 20th century, and a gargantuan amount of social and economic progress. So I think one doesn't want to throw away the idea that there's been progress over the past centuries in any sense of the word. I think the idea that that progress is linear, that, sort of once you end up in a sort of prosperous democratic camp, there can be no backsliding, there can be no problems. That clearly is wrong. And I think that there were a lot of people who kind of saw the collapse of the Soviet Union as kind of heralding, again, as you said, this kind of utopian era where many, many countries would end up in the democratic camp, they'd be prosperous and they'd be stable. So I think history does go in cycles, but I also don't think we should, sort of neglect the fact that we really are all better off at the beginning of the 21st century than we were in the past. We just have to understand that there's lots of backsliding and missteps along the way. And so, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think the other, the dimension we haven't really touched on yet is that as economic power becomes more concentrated, that's going to become a likely source of setbacks in this progress towards a greater democratization. But now let's get from the theoretical to the specific, as in what about this guy Trump? We're all dealing now with a kind of well, not all of us. I mean, he has many supporters, of course, but many of us are dealing with a kind of shock and, trying to adjust ourselves to the new political reality. But let's get to the biggest, I think, political science question being debated about Trump, which is are we seeing the onset, in your opinion, Professor Berman, of an incipient fascism in the United States?
So I don't throw that term around loosely at all, having studied the interwar period quite a bit. Fascism is a really, really nasty kind of political regime, and I don't think we're really anywhere near that, and I don't think Donald Trump is a fascist, and I don't think American society is fascist. There are some worrying trends, right? A diminished support for many liberal values, some diminution perhaps of democratic institutions and checks and balances. And certainly, even if one lives in a country with as long a history of democratic political institutions as the United States, you always want to be careful about any erosion of those institutions or the norms that support them. So fascism, I do not like that term at all. I think it means something very, very different from anything that we're seeing in either the United States and Europe today. Fascism was a profoundly anti-democratic, revolutionary, and certainly in its German form, racist type of regime, and we really are not in that kind of situation today. That, again, is not to say that we should not be wary and that there aren't perhaps some real threats to democracy, but let's say fascism for what it was and not sort of throw that term around loosely. Otherwise, we begin to no longer be able to differentiate between different kinds of regimes in different time periods.
Yeah, I've been struggling with this whole debate myself because reading Robert Paxton on the anatomy of fascism and other people, and you get these 13-point, 12-point definitions of what fascism is or isn't, and people say, Trump hits 5 or 6 or 8 of them, and that makes him a fascist. But you could point to other periods in American history where we, in my opinion, hit 8 or 9, or, at what point it's still somewhere between, in my opinion, a vaguely defined political term and an epithet. So, on the other hand, you did suggest, if I understood you correctly, that there are disturbing trends. So whether you call them fascism or not, would you say that would you agree, did I understand you correctly, that there are things that should be the source of concern in what we're seeing from President Trump?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one would be any kind of attacks upon or erosion of the system of checks and balances. That is to say that we're supposed to have different institutions in this country that check each other to make sure that there aren't too great concentrations of power. So one problematic trend that a lot of people have talked about is Trump's and many of his advisors' attacks on the media. I mean, a free press is absolutely integral to democracy. And while we haven't seen Trump kind of shutting down media outlets that are opposed to him, the kinds of attacks on the media, the sidelining of certain journalists or media outlets from access to information or to key decision makers, that is definitely very problematic. And you would not want to see that go very far without thinking, okay, look, this is a real threat to our ability to sort of maintain a lively democracy.
Yeah, and I'm also, and again, there again, it's cyclical. I mean, Nixon did a certain amount of that. But it seems extreme. It seems harsher than we've seen in the past. And you also see, I'm also concerned, highly concerned about the nativistic aspects of what Trump is doing that seem to me to be unprecedented, at least in modern history. Obviously, we have institutional racism as a core part of American history, but we've been evolving away from that, hopefully. And instead, now we have a president who, and this to me is deeply disturbing, is making it policy. For example, counterterrorism is only to focus on Muslims, and a ban on countries that is in effect a Muslim ban against immigration and refugee acceptance, the wall and the demonization of Hispanics and so on. It seems to me that that is something deeply, deeply disturbing. Do you agree with that?
Well, it is deeply, deeply disturbing, but let's not forget that this has been a sort of, again, a cycle in American politics for, well, as long as we've had the United States. I mean, even if one wanted to push aside the treatment of African Americans, which is obviously a very special and deeply pernicious part of American history, I mean, these nativist trends are very common. I mean, bans on immigration from certain parts of the world. I mean, we've seen that throughout American history. During our last great period of immigration in the late 19th and early 20th century, we saw that, you know, sort of nativist politics are definitely part of American political history. And again, I think we just haven't seen this quite so much in the last decades. Now, again, saying that it's happened in the past doesn't make it better, but, you know, it's not unprecedented. And we should think about the kinds of causes of these things in the past and the kinds of consequences of them, and not see Trump as kind of jumping out of, you know, sort of the blue. I mean, there is a very famous kind of characterization of these kinds of periods in American politics, you know, sort of the politics of paranoia and things like that. I mean, we've had these periods in the past. I mean, I'm sure many of our parents and many perhaps of your listeners as well can remember the McCarthy era. That was not so much about immigration per se, but again, a sort of paranoid style, this kind of sense that America was under siege and that we had these kind of internal and external enemies that were trying to, you know, sort of subvert us. I mean, these periods we've had in the past, and while we should be very wary to push back against them, we should also not recognize that, you know, there is this tendency in American politics that, you know, that we just haven't experienced recently, I think.
So it's probably a good time to reread Richard Hofstadter's work on
yes.
Paranoid style. So let's end on on perhaps a more practical note, if possible. Professor Berman, what do you think are the lessons from these other periods of paranoia in American history? And I mean, you can go back to the early 20th century and the anti-communist fears under Attorney General Palmer, as well as the McCarthy era. In the 19th century, there were these fears of Italian immigrants, fears of Irish immigrants, and so on. What are some lessons from those periods that might be applied to, you know, countering the forces of Trumpism in the present day?
Well, that's really a great question, and that really is sort of the question of the day. I mean, if we look back at the past, it seems that there are sort of two things that, you know, one might know. One is, to some degree, cycles do tend to burn themselves out. And that's not just because, you know, there's a certain kind of, you know, historical necessity there, but simply because there are certain ideals and patterns in American history. And if Trump pushes too far, I think a lot of people who are willing to cut him some slack now, because it's right at the beginning of his presidency, will begin to be more and more discomforted if he continues along this path. But I also think that, you know, perhaps what we've seen, right, is the beginnings of a more mobilized opposition. You know, protests and rallies are important, but they're the beginning rather than the end of a pushback. They have to now become somewhat more organized. People have to start working from the grassroots up. And that doesn't mean just kind of rebuilding the power of the Democratic Party, but that means making certain Republicans pay a price for supporting some of the more radical initiatives that Trump might be interested in. And so the other thing that kind of pushes these cycles back is some significant, hard-working political organization. Again, make politicians pay for policies that are seen as problematic. And that's, I think, the sort of precipice we're on today. Lots of people mobilized, lots of people out on the streets, at airports, at women's marches. But again, what really needs to happen now is that kind of protest needs to be turned into actually constructive political change and pushback.
Okay, well, that's a great summary. Appreciate that. Professor Sheri Berman, professor of political science at Barnard College and author of 2 books, The Primacy of Politics and the Social Democratic Movement. Thanks for coming on the program.
My pleasure.